Well, looks like it's time to go over another crappy NES basketball game. This is Jordan vs. Bird on the NES, an early Electronic Arts game that isn't exactly memorable. As you can see, this is a one-on-one basketball game, and that's about it. I mean, there is a three-point shooting contest, which is boring. And then you've got the slam dunk contest, where you run around the whole time trying to find the right place to push the A button. Overall, this game pretty much sucks. But you know, it's not really that simple, right? There's a lot of stuff going on here, including a pretty interesting history behind this franchise. Now, to be honest with you, the NES port really is not that great, and it's nowhere near as good as the other Electronic Arts NES games. But the earlier versions of this game actually do kind of stand out. But, of course, I gotta go take you back to the past. For all intents and purposes, mainstream home video gaming started with this baby, the Atari 2600. And the first home basketball video game was probably this one, Basketball for the 2600. It totally sucks, as you can see. I love how the box calls this two video games, where it's really just a single crappy game you can play one or two player. There are a bunch of different cartridge variations that came up over the years, but it was always the same crappy game. And this game is about as much fun as it looks. So this was likely one-on-one because they didn't have the capacity to actually make more players. That's at least what I'm guessing. I don't know. Maybe they did and they couldn't do it. Whatever. Anyway, when Atari came out with its awful 5200 console back in October 1982, the company decided to update that crappy basketball game into something that they were going to call Real Sports Basketball. But unfortunately for Atari, that game was never released. There are a few prototypes of this game that have managed to stick around over the years. The final version is this loaner cartridge, which is dated mid-December 1983. It's not an awful game, but well, it is what it is. But at least they were able to render a crowd and make the baskets actually look like real baskets. Now, the interesting thing here is that mid-December 1983 date, which is actually pretty late for an Atari video game. And that's because of a little thing that we call the video game crash of 1983. December 16th, 1983 was really late for a sports title for the Atari 5200. And as this old issue of Retro Gamer tells us, Atari apparently also produced versions of this game for the 2600 and 8-bit consoles, though none were ever released. You see, Atari had a really bad year in 1983, thanks in large part to the poor reviews and poor sales for its E.T. game, which came out in December 1982. And let me interject here to say that I know that this is a tangent, and we're going to keep going off slightly into this tangent. But trust me, this does relate to Electronic Arts and Trip Hawkins, especially if you want to understand why they did what they did. E.T. was hotly anticipated when it came out in early December 1982, just in time for Christmas. I mean, as you can see here, advertisers treated E.T. as the best new piece of software on the 2600 and hyped it up way beyond belief. By late January 1983, however, it was clear that not all was right at Atari. There's a lot to talk about in this article, but I want to draw your attention to this part here that mentions the optimism of Warner Communications, the company that owned Atari, despite clear signs of a major problem. I mean, it's easy for us to go look back in hindsight and say the crash was obviously going to happen. I mean, there were tons of like copycat games coming out all the time, like almost every day. Remember like Chase the Chuck Wagon and stuff like that. And competing companies even were making systems that could play Atari 2600 games, right? I mean, this was not a healthy market. But when you dig into the newspapers, you'll find a bunch of people who were completely blind to what was happening right in front of them. USA Today published this article in late February 1983, predicting that Atari's revenue would continue to increase through 1986. The 1983 revenue and earnings projection here is in millions, and this is absolutely delusional. But no matter where you looked, the media was bullish on video games and Atari, and there was this feeling that kids would just buy anything. Now, it's really March 1983 where the signs of a major problem started to emerge. And the best place to see this is not in like the feature articles, no, it's in the advertisements. So if you were in the Rock Island, Illinois area, you could always head out to Venture. This is from early March 1983. And look at this, the hottest game from Christmas 1982 was now on sale for only $10, marked all the way down. There were car salesmen who would give you a 2600 console for free if you bought a crappy 1983 Mercury. But the biggest dagger was certainly Toys R Us offering the 2600 for under $70. This is from May 1983. So that's really not a great sign. That's a sign that Warner Communications had vastly overestimated the demand that kids had for really crappy video games that stopped being fun after like 5 minutes. This was also a sign that the video game industry was probably not as robust as people had once thought. And this is where we finally get to the story of Trip Hawkins. Trip Hawkins was a big sports fan who studied game design in college. Hawkins was a big fan of Stratomatic board games and was fascinated with simulating professional sports, sort of like me, to be honest. Hawkins had formed Electronic Arts sometime in the middle of 1982, only to run straight into the quickly developing video game crash. Now, the thing you've got to remember about Hawkins and Electronic Arts is that there was no guarantee of success. They were over 5 years away from finally coming out with John Madden Football. And remember, that was like a computer game first. That game wasn't really a success until the Genesis port came out for Christmas 1990, right? Back in early 1983, Electronic Arts actually didn't have any products. It was basically a bunch of guys fiddling around with simple video games, hoping that something would eventually work. EA's beginnings included publishing computer games like MULE that were actually created by other developers. The games might be primitive by modern standards, but the packaging was very impressive. This was the golden age of old big box video games, and you can tell that they took a lot of inspiration from the way the vinyl records were packaged. Actually, to be honest with you, the packaging was usually better than the game. And this was something that would never really fly on a little Atari system. You see, the Atari games were mostly just about the game, not about like the box being a work of art or anything like that. The thing you have to realize is that EA took a pretty big risk when it decided to bypass the home video game market and develop its games just for the computers instead. But when Atari crashed and burned, the gamble really paid off. By October 1983, it was clear that Atari was crashing and burning. This was also around the time that newspapers started printing long and detailed articles about the ridiculous way Atari had been spending its money. And honestly, when the wire press services were coming out with articles about the industry losing $800 million, it was probably the wrong time to come out with your next big game. But Trip Hawkins was not going to be dissuaded. In fact, rather than trying to avoid media attention and wait out the bad press, Hawkins and Electronic Arts decided to go to the media. And this is the story of Electronic Arts that everybody ignores. I'm not sure how he did it, but Hawkins was featured in a Rolling Stone article sometime in late October or early November 1983. This article was more a press release and a fluff piece than actual journalism, but it did reflect the unbridled enthusiasm that Hawkins had for the computer gaming market. And you've got to remember that the company only had something like 1 or 2 games released by this point. This part of the article talks about how well the company was doing, conveniently sidestepping the fact that the basketball simulation game it describes wasn't going to be actually released for several months. Believe it or not, you actually can buy publicity, right? Now, I clearly don't have any money because I haven't done it, but that's what Hawkins did. In fact, this was the Electronic Arts business model since the beginning of the company, and I'm not exaggerating this point. I don't know of any other video game company in 1983 that went after the press the way that Hawkins and EA did. And of course, this should remind you of a certain video game journalism controversy that took place a little over a decade ago. Companies indeed do buy positive press. They always have and likely always will. The thing that's crazy about this is that Trip Hawkins basically turned himself into a video game celebrity before he had ever done anything. Check out this cheap paperback, for example, The Computer Entrepreneurs, published in 1984, less than a year after Electronic Arts finally released its first video game. And well, what do you know, here's a chapter devoted to Trip Hawkins. There were only 6 games listed here, and the funny thing is that EA had only actually developed the basketball game. The others were games that EA had published under contract. So hey, like I said, you actually can buy fame. And by the way, don't feel so surprised when you hear me say dismissive or negative things about Electronic Arts. I probably wouldn't hate the company so much if it weren't for things like, the Madden games getting worse every year, all of the loot boxes, EA buying up studios only to totally shut them down and stop really good game franchises, or the awful way the company treats its employees, or that horrible SimCity fiasco back in 2013. You know, if you ignore all of the awful stuff that the company has done over the years, it's really not all that bad. Anyway, EA came out with One-on-One in 1983, and this was really the company's first hit. Now, in the early 1980s, the NBA playoffs featured a yearly meeting between the Boston Celtics and Philadelphia 76ers. And of course, Julius Erving and Larry Bird matched up with each other all 3 years.
Looking low to Parrish. Bird will take it. The running right-hander blocked by Erving. They want a goaltending. It's not there. Cheeks all the way and in.
While we tend to remember the Bird-Magic rivalry, the truth is that the Erving-Bird rivalry was just as intense.
3-on-2 to Ford on the side to Bird and 2.
And these games are tons of fun to watch even after all these years.
A lot of things that these two teams can do to each other. Jay with a...
If you were a basketball fan in the early 1980s, you absolutely knew who these guys were. Now, Trip Hawkins was a sports fan, and he also knew the power of celebrity endorsement. And I should note that he was smart enough to realize that E.T. on the Atari 2600 did not fail because big names no longer sold. No, he knew that it failed because the game sucked. It's total garbage. Anyway, Hawkins was able to get Larry Bird and Julius Erving to sign a contract with EA that allowed him to stick their names on his company's one-on-one basketball game. And so this is what the box art looked like. Once again, this was designed to look like a record sleeve. In fact, you could probably hang this up in your room. None of the quotes on the bottom meant anything about the gameplay, but that was beside the point. This was professional box art, and it was a really fancy way to hold a flimsy floppy disk and a few brief notes. But Hawkins was all about form over substance. So as long as the box looked good, the game was going to sell. This is kind of like how YouTube videos work, right? If you got the right thumbnail and a good title, people are going to be more likely to watch, even if it's absolute garbage. Anyway, the Apple II version came out first and featured surprisingly good music and really good animations for the day. You could tell the difference between the two players, which was a lot better than that Atari garbage. And sure, maybe the game was primitive, but the animations were actually pretty good. In fact, if you made a dunk just right, you could shatter the backboard. That would prompt the janitor to come over and clean up the mess. One-on-One was pretty popular. I mean, this was popular enough that they ported it over to other computer systems. And all indications I've seen are that this game sold really well in 1984, despite the fact that the video games industry in general was doing very poorly. The earliest advertisement I could find was printed on March 1st, 1984, which is when I think the Apple II game was actually first released. Rather than sticking with a single platform, EA came out with ports for all of the major computers in 1984. Newspapers kept advertising the game, though they didn't always show you what the box looked like. And Hawkins kept figuring out ways to get the press to talk about him. And I'm curious to know if any of you went to this event in the Boston area where you could buy the game for cheap and meet Larry Bird in person. So that advertisement was from September 1984, right? This is after the famous 1984 NBA Finals. Everybody talks about like being the birth of the modern NBA. The truth is that the NBA was a very different league back in those days. It was still kind of a small-time thing. Anyway, as the home video game market finally developed again, EA decided to keep that tradition of one-on-one alive. Atari produced its Atari 7800 system back in 1984, but it didn't start selling it until 1986 due to all of the chaos at the company. Though the system was already dated, that made the 7800 basically a competitor with Nintendo's NES. And of course, EA made sure to come out with a version of one-on-one for this system. It's exactly like the computer versions, except with a little bit more color. And it's not a horrible game, though I really hate how Larry Bird shoots as soon as he touches the ball. You see, the truth about one-on-one is that it really is not a horrible game. It's kind of fun, and it works really well if you play a two-player. The NES version, however, is way too similar to the early computer versions of the game. And that similarity gives it this Atari 2600 feel, which was really dated by 1989. For whatever reason, EA partnered with Milton Bradley to sell this game, and I'm not sure that I understand why. Milton Bradley released a handful of NES games, most of which were produced by other companies. Electronic Arts, meanwhile, released a number of its popular computer games on the NES, usually by partnering with other companies to handle the publishing. Skate or Die, for example, was originally an Electronic Arts computer game that wound up being released through Konami's Ultra Games label on the NES. The same is true of Kings of the Beach, which I used to play all the time as a kid without realizing that it was an Electronic Arts game. These games featured a lot of bonus animations that the company was known for. And you know, those games are okay. I mean, I used to rent Skate or Die every once in a while as a kid. I would get sick of it after like an hour or so. And also, back when I was a kid, my best friend and I would share our NES games. I bet a lot of you guys did this, right? We would like borrow it or trade it or whatever. And either he or I owned Kings of the Beach. I really can't remember whose game it originally was. Anyway, a couple years later, when I was in middle school, I got a copy of Super Spike V-Ball for the NES. And then Kings of the Beach kind of didn't seem like as much fun anymore. But the difference, of course, is that Jordan vs. Bird was basically a game from 1983. Those other games were originally made in 87 or 88. I mean, the biggest problem with this game is that it was released on the NES. This is honestly no different from the original version. In fact, the graphics really are not much better. And the gameplay was also really dated for its time, unless of course you really liked one-on-one basketball for some strange reason. So the biggest problem with Jordan vs. Bird is that there were already better basketball games on the NES. I'm not sure why in the world they would think that kids would be interested in playing this like age-old one-on-one game instead of something that was like newly created and a little bit more modern. I know I was ragging on Hoops the other day, but its one-on-one mode is actually better than Jordan vs. Bird. Okay, maybe the defense sucks, but notice that the screen actually scrolls in this game. And the dunk animations are a lot better than anything Electronic Arts was doing. Of course, if your parents really loved you, they just would get you double dribble instead. This game is so much better than Jordan vs. Bird that it isn't even funny. But you know as well as I do why Jordan vs. Bird was actually popular. It's the star name, stupid. Michael Jordan was already larger than life, and so naturally you had to have the game with Jordan's name on it, even if it was actually 6-year-old recycled garbage. You can even see this in newspaper articles. And man, this columnist was full of awful dad jokes. I'm not sure why anybody would want to pay $40 for this game, but I guess it beats getting a Fisher-Price toy Happy Meal for Christmas instead. Just pray that your out-of-touch parents don't screw up and get you the Tiger Electronics handheld version instead. Anyway, the one other thing I really need to touch on about this game is how the stupid slam dunk competition works, right? So my feeling is that either Electronic Arts or Milton Bradley looked at this old game and said, we got to put more out there, right? Because like only one-on-one game no one's going to want to play. So they stuck in the three-point competition and this slam dunk competition. Now, we got to talk about the slam dunk stuff because this is the direction that EA's basketball games went in for the next couple of years. Okay, in the game itself, you can dunk it if you get to the right part of the court and you push the button, which is normal. In the slam dunk competition, you first choose from a list of dunks. Now you have to know where to push the A button, and the game doesn't tell you that at all. And so you run around the court like an idiot, pushing A over and over again while the time runs out. So you would think that you could like look at the manual or something like that for tips, right? Ha ha, wrong. Look at what I have here. This is a scan of the original NES manual. It tells you all about the two players, plus the fact that the game has sweet spots, shooting percentages, and all of that other garbage. The game tells you that you have a specific spot you need to push the A button on to execute the slam dunk, but there's nothing in the book about where you're supposed to run to. Instead, you get all of these generic quotations from Michael Jordan about how he likes to play offense in real life, none of which means anything for this game. Anyway, fortunately, they give you this like warm-up mode where you can like run around pushing the A button to figure this stuff out. Anyway, after a while, you figure out where you're supposed to go. I'm not sure that I understand why some dunks score higher than others. This game gives you basically no clues. And if you release the A button at the wrong time, Jordan will miss the dunk entirely. Some of these dunks are iconic, sure. But do you really want to sit in front of your NES all day long practicing these things? So this reminds me a lot of Skate or Die. As I recall, and it's been a while since I've seriously played it, but as I recall, it had kind of similar mechanics. You could do like cool things and tricks and stuff in the game, but you would only get them to work if you sat there and you practiced it like over and over and over again. Like, why not just go outside and skateboard on your own? Or why not go outside and play basketball, right? I mean, playing a video game should be something you can just pick up and go, you know, like with NBA Jam. Why would you want to play a video game where you have to sit there and practice at it over and over again just to do something basic? Anyway, I bring this up because Lakers vs. Celtics on the PC had the exact same mechanic, and note that this game also came out in 1989. Now this is actually a 5-on-5 basketball game, which makes it a lot more fun than just 1-on-1. And if you want to dunk in this game, you have to know the exact spot on the floor to go to. This mechanic was a really stupid mechanic that originated in Jordan vs. Bird. And Electronic Arts took this way too far, eventually coming up with these marquee spots and the other ridiculousness. And so, in Team USA Basketball on the Genesis, running a normal fast break results in a jump shot from up close. As a result, you wind up moving away from the basket looking for the right spot to push the button and execute the dunk. This is the worst design for a basketball game I've ever seen, and it all started with the slam dunk contest in Jordan vs. Bird. And it is awful that they used the sacred name of Michael Jordan like this. Yeah, I know, the name helped them sell games. But seriously, if you're gonna make a Michael Jordan game, can't you at least like try to make something that's like fun and playable? Anyway, it's an okay game, but it's kind of mediocre for 1989. If we had been paying attention back then, we would have realized that Electronic Arts was perfectly happy to shovel garbage at us in order to get our money. This might not be the worst NES basketball game, but I really don't ever want to play this again. Anyway, there you have it. That's the story behind Jordan vs. Bird. Now, I wish I could tell you that Electronic Arts has gotten better over the years. In all truth, I think the company has gotten worse. But the Apple II and the Commodore 64 versions of this game actually are kind of fun to play, especially 2 players. The NES version, however, that game sucks. Just stay away from it.